Summer of 1348, the bells of San Bartolo tolled over Pistoia until it seemed the city itself was a bell, bronze voice in a bowl of stone. On the third day after St. John's feast, the priors of the city and the bishop's man sat beneath a wool tapestry in the Palazzo del Comune and drafted an edict that would govern breath, bread, and water. The seal was set with iron, the cord taken from the sacristy's drawer, crimson as the little line in a clerk's ear. By sunset, a beadle with a leather hood rang his handbell and read the decree at the Four Lions crossroads where the market lanes met. He spoke in that measured tone meant to sound like order. No one was to draw water from the Brana by the tannery sluice. No one was to wash their linen in the public bathhouse, which was to be shuttered and its brass basins turned over like graves denied. No one was to enter the house of a sick man save the priest, the doctor, and the gravedigger. Doors of afflicted dwellings would be tied with cord and touched with wax. Anyone who loosened those cords without warrant would taste the stocks and the lash. Processions would be held on Fridays with bare feet and unshod candles. Cloth from the dead was to be burned in the lime field. Pigs were driven out. Cats and dogs would be seized. Merchants bringing wares from Lucca would stop at the St. James Gate and present their bundles to the inspector. Suspect cargo would be smoked with juniper or refused. The dice tables under the eaves were to be overturned. The edict said nothing about fear. It spoke only of penalties and prayer. The city took it like bitter draught. In Via delle Sette Torri, the apothecary strung up bunches of rue and wormwood until his door smelled like a forest dreaming of church. He sold vinegar by the spoon and called it angel's breath. In the lanes behind the cathedral, the rakers, who lived by other men's filth, splashed wine on their hands and pretended it mattered. Ragged friars muttered litany, and the few who had kept their summer shoes wore them anyway, saying they would not let their heels know the grit of death. At the lower market where the fishmongers swore and the flies wore crowns, a mother named Alina folded a piece of linen meant for the Saturday wash and listened to the bellman say the bathhouse was closed. Her husband had died in spring of a cough that was not the plague, or so they said, and she had learned to count the days by the weight of her bucket. She mended nets for a lira a week, and sometimes slipped river reeds into the wicker to make it stronger and look new, and no one scolded her for deceit because everyone in Pistoia lied to survive, and it was counted a lesser sin than touching a cursed latch. The edict had a paragraph that no one heard and everyone learned. The watchers would walk the lanes and look for chalk crosses on doors. They would carry a cord and a lump of wax and a slip of parchment with the city's seal, a crowned lily the color of old blood, and if they found a house where the moans were too regular and the coughs too full, the cord would be tied around the handle and the wax touched to the knot, and the slip would be nailed with a square nail, not to curse the occupants but to bind them to the city's will and to God's timetable. If anyone broke it, for bread, for air, for any reason at all, then the beadle with the hood would put them in the stocks at the north gate and read the clause aloud, while the pigeons shat from the gatehouse and the market boys tried to be brave enough to laugh. Would you have kept inside with the fever? Would you have put your children at the window and lied to the watcher that they were cousins? Well, only visiting. The first cord went up on the feast of St. Swithin. It was tied around a door so warped that it gaped like a toothless mouth, and the wax sat under the priest's thumbprint like a small red eye. The mother inside cried that the windows were too small to pour out the night's air. Air is not your enemy, said the priest, though he kept a clove under his tongue. It is the Lord's testing. The gravedigger stood by, hands like paddles, studying the ground as if he were already calculating a trench. In the lanes that ran with dishwater, the ordinance against water pricked more than thirst. For generations the women of Pistoia had soaped linen in the bathhouse, where the floors of stone sloped to a channel, and the bathmen shouted the hours and slapped the water with paddles to move the scum. The edict closed the baths, and the bathmen were turned into incense carriers for the procession, which they did with the same grim rhythm. Men who knew how to keep the water hot now learned how to keep candles from guttering in wind. On Fridays the city dragged its feet, literally. Bare soles went black with soot and market crumbs as the population moved in slow penance around the piazza, singing a miserere that sounded like an old boat dragging its keel. Children were taught to keep their voices low, not because God cared, but because the beadles did. No wails, they said, no theater, as if grief were a playhouse that might be shut by decree. A relic was carried, a flake of bone in glass, and for an hour the fear of breath was replaced by the fear of absence. And then the bell ended it and the watchers went to work again, walking with their iron seals. All the while, the ordinary laws did not sleep. The assize of bread remained posted with its neat columns of weight and price. It was amended twice in July to allow lighter loaves as wheat grew dear. The cheese scales at the cheese gate were calibrated under the eye of a man who looked as if he might cry if anyone touched his weights, and he pinched the squint of his wife to keep it from being bribe enough. The tithe chest gaped and shut and gaped again, swallowing measures of oats and pence, swallowing the names of those who could not pay and therefore would not be named at the Mass. It was a season of latches, on doors, on boxes, on mouths. Alina learned the new paths. If she avoided the tannery sluice, she could climb to the upper steps where the water from the rain cistern could be drawn, at hours now written on a board as if the rain obeyed clocks. The custodian sat on a stool with a tally stick and did not let the poor take extra buckets. He had the face of a man who feared he was alive in error. She waited for the bell that marked the allowed hour, and when it struck, she drew her share, watching the sheen of it in the dark lip of the pail. Her little boy had a cough that was not the plague, she told herself, because his neck did not swell, and he still wanted onion. The girl, 7, had made a doll of twisted thread and wore it at her belt like a good luck charm, though the priest said luck was a thin idol in a fat world. There were days when the watchers found nothing, and the wax seals softened in the sun and slid crooked and had to be pressed again with a forefinger already red with other houses. There were days when the bellman read the clause about the stocks, and no one listened, because a cart went by with a man in it and a sheet, and the sheet was the part the city could look at, and the thought of the thing under the sheet was a stone in the mouth. Sometimes, late, the wind came from the west and brought the tannery to the kernel of the city. The stench of skins turned with urine and lime met the incense and made a marriage of hell, and heaven no one could dismiss. Do not hang laundry from the upper windows, the edict had added on the second page. It offends the eye and spreads vapors. The upper windows were where the cool air lived. A woman beaten for a shirt, flapping like a surrender rag, made a noise like water on hot iron. The beadle used the flat of his hand because he had an order not to bruise, not because he was kind. Such distinctions are the crown of petty power. In the bishop's court, a man was charged with breaking the cord. He had a wife with 2 days of fever and a child who would not stop aching for figs. He had gone to the market before dawn and slipped his hand through the slit between door and jamb and worried the knot with his fingertips until the wax came loose. He had pressed it back when he returned. But the watcher had marked the cord with a line of soot, a trick borrowed from thieves, and the soot was smudged. In the court the man said, "I feared shame more than stocks. The neighbor's count, who brings bread." The bishop's man, whose face had not had a fever in years, sentenced him to 3 days in the stocks by the north gate, 24 strokes with a rod on the 3rd day, if he looked anyone in the eye while his feet were clamped. "Do not let your gaze say rebellion," the beadle told him. He kept his gaze like a coin, small, spent. The stocks had their own smell, of wet oak and the human glaze that comes from skin pressed and pressed again. Men stood too close to get a better look at someone finally still. Women went by in a hurry, eyes on their grocery lists written in memory and habit. Children laughed the way they laughed at geese, not at the animal but at the way their own sound bounced back from the gate's arch. Sometimes a stone was thrown. More often it was bread, and not cruelly, and then the beadle took it away because feeding was not part of the lesson. The man in the stocks learned how to understand the city with his nose. Garlic from the south, tar from the wheelwright, the sweet rot of overripe pears, the clean panic of horses that sense fever in humans the way they sense thunder. Farther down, near the lime field where cloth went to dye, the bathmen stood with their hands in their sleeves and talked of water as if it were a lover gone to another town. They had drained the copper cauldrons and tipped them on their sides and wiped them, and still the edict scent of vinegar hung in the air. "They will open us again," one said, "when they tire of being dirty." The older bathman shook his head. "They are not tired of being dirty. They are tired of being watched. It is different." The market rules hardened, because the city needed to feel that some thread still held. The bread inspector, a thin man with a book like a hand's width and a tin badge, weighed loaves on his traveling scale and chalked tick marks onto a door to keep count. He found a baker whose bread ran light and took 2 from the shelf as evidence. The baker said the grain had stones in it from the last harvest, and half the wheat from the plain had been spoiled by mice. The inspector listened with the courtesy of a man who knows the pillory is his final argument. He had the baker strapped between the uprights, while the millboy watched and took inventory with his eyes of every cheek that turned away and every one that did not. If the city could not prevent the invisible, it could punish the visible. This is governance in plague. On the second procession of August, the relic of St. Ada was brought out, its case polished until it shed flakes of old wax. People knelt and made the sign and did not kiss. The beadle stood with his rod like a semaphore to keep mouths from touching glass. The bishop preached that God had made princes and pestilence for the same reason, to scour men's pride. You could feel the words like dry beans in your palm. A woman whispered that if God punished pride, he should start in the palazzo, and the next day a whisperer was named at the door of the cathedral and asked to scrub the flagstones with vinegar, a penance named Sweet Labor. Alina watched her on her knees, and the sight entered her like a stone and settled there. Alina, cautious as ash, made one mistake. On a Monday hot enough to wrinkle linen on the line, she brought her bucket to the cistern in the hour allowed and found that the water smelled of something sweet, like straw gone soft. She waited. Others waited. The custodian sniffed and shook his head, and said they must draw at the lower fountain instead, though the edict forbade it. Within hours, the tanners washed their hides. A dozen people went, and Alina with them, because a dozen bodies are a kind of law stronger than parchment. They drew fast and kept quiet, and then the watcher came with his iron seal and made a noise like a prayer, and like the scrapping of a blade, a noise he had practiced because he intended it to be remembered. He seized the rope and tied the fountain's post to a chain and locked it, and the padlock was the size of hunger. He took 2 names at random. One was Alina's. She was told to pay a fine half a lira, and if she could not, to stand an hour on the penitent's stool in the square with a sprig of basil in her mouth, the city's favorite joke that had been old before the current priors were born. Basil sweetens the breath, the beadle would say, and the law and men laughed, and women did not. Alina had exactly 1 lira and a copper. She paid and walked away, light-headed with relief and shame. If she had been poorer by 1 copper, she would have been lifted onto the stool. That evening, because the day had not yet had enough, an ox cart lost a wheel and a barrel of lime smashed open on the street, and the powder rose like a phantom and burned everyone's eyes. The gravedigger, returning from his trench, coughed and swore, and then cried, not for death but for lime, which is the kind of truth cities prefer. By mid-August the plague was everywhere in Pistoia that a rumor could enter, and nowhere that an edict could leave. The cord and wax on doors multiplied. The watcher's thumb grew smooth as bone where the wax had shined it. The bellman's voice, always measured, acquired a rust that he covered with clove and wine. The market cries grew thin and threadbare. Men selling the last of their goods made their voices soft, as if they could hide them under the price. Priests learned to say the commendation in a tone that carried through shudders. Tithes were forgiven for some, a gesture like pouring water into a cracked bowl. On a night when the moon's face looked like a coin that had been sanded, Alina's little boy woke with a knot in his neck and the fever's shine in his eyes. The cord on her door had not been tied. No one had marked them. She sat and held him and prayed to every name she knew, to saints who had never worn this soil and to the city itself, as if stone could pity. Her girl snored softly, exhausted by a day of not playing with other children. Alina had onions and vinegar, lint and a handful of salt wrapped in cloth. She had a relic, a pebble the priest had touched to St. Otto's glass and given her for courage, which is to say because he had nothing else. At dawn she climbed to the window and spoke to the watcher before he could speak to her. "I will keep the cord," she said, and held up her hands as if she wanted him to gag them. He nodded. He tied the red cord and pressed the wax into it, and marked the soot line. He did not meet her eyes. He looked instead at the crack in the lintel that ran like a drought. He muttered the edict's language as if it would save them both. No entering, no leaving, no water except what the custodian brought in a clay jug left on the step. No bread except what the guild would provide twice. Alina told her son fairy truth, that the cord kept out evil and the wax was a saint's bead. She told him the bell that rang each hour was the city's heart beating. She told him that if he could sleep through it, he would be well by Martinus. He slept for a while and woke and slept. In the afternoon the custodian left a jug and bread and stamped off, and she called a blessing on his head that felt like a curse. A neighbor slid a scrap of cloth under the gap in the door, a strip of old linen soaked in wine, and Alina pressed it to the boy's temples and thanked God for neighbors. On the second day, the beadle came to count and to say the words, like a priest of law. By order of the priors, whoso shall break this seal, his speech had worn smooth. He wore a mask of leather stitched by a saddler and named, half in jest, a doctor's guard. The leather was damp inside with his breath, and it made his words feel like they came from a stable. He did not want to be hated. He did not want to be remembered. He hammered the slip with the crowned lily and moved on. His cord, his wax, his rod, the regalia of a minor king in a city of fear. Inside, the fever rode Alina's boy like a horse, and there were hours when he seemed to sleep with eyes open, the old women's sign of a borrowed soul. The girl recited the pater with her doll clasped to her belly. The room was a ceremony of small things. The scrape of the jug's lip on clay, the pattern of light through the shutters, the way a flea chooses a road like any monarch with a map. Side, the raker's cart went by, and the wheels left two wet commas the sun could not read. On the fourth day, a procession passed, and the relics' little bells rang so softly that only someone listening for a way to live could hear them. Alina stood just inside the door and pressed her forehead to the wood and listened to the chant. A woman in the street, barefoot and shaking, sang a wrong note, and a child half laughed, half wept, and the beadle tapped his rod 3 times, as if to measure the moment into obedience. Tell me, would you have sung? Would you have kept the breath in your chest like a coin in a fist, not to be spent? The girl tugged at Alina's skirt, and Alina looked down and saw her mouth was dry as flour. She chewed the crust and gave her the softer middle. She held the cup to her boy's lips and told him that water in a jug could be a river in the mouth. He drank and slept. He coughed and slept. She pressed him as if she could press him back into his first size when he fit in the crook of her arm. The cord outside creaked when the sun warmed it. The wax line shone like a fresh wound, bloodless and rude. At the north gate, the man who had broken the cord served his third day. He kept his gaze down. When the rod fell, it sounded like a broom striking a board, not like a thing that cut, because it was made not to gore but to humiliate. He counted in his head not from 1 to 24, but from 1 to harvests he might not see. He did not know Alina. She did not know him. The city made them instruments of a rule that was part prayer, part arithmetic, part fear that wore a crown, and called itself order. This was Pistoia in the plague, cords like rosaries across doors, water rationed like absolution, bread weighed and found wanting, stocks polished by the penitent and the stubborn, bells that told you the hour and the cost of it. The edict did not end. It extended itself as a shadow extends when the sun lowers, changing shape, same darkness. Somewhere, men in the palazzo added a clause about barbers not opening boils and carters not carrying straw from infected houses. Somewhere, a woman held a child and dared the world to take its breath before it took his. There were 100 little kingdoms in the city: the bathman's empty hall, the bread inspector's traveling table, the watcher's belt with its iron seal and wax, and over them all a crown of fear that glittered when it caught the candlelight, because even terror, when polished by repetition, takes on a shine. If you had walked there, shoes in your hand like an offering to the edict, you would have learned the streets by their stenches: tannery to south, lime to east, vinegar everywhere, incense like a veil over a corpse. You would have learned which alleys sang with women's voices, which with gravediggers' jokes, which with boys trying to reinvent laughter as a safe game. And in a room tied by cord, a mother laid her cheek to a boy's damp shoulder and listened to the city's bell. It said what bells always say: time passes. It did not say how much or what it takes. She made her own answer in a language of touch and crumbs and water, measured to a mouth. Sighed. The watcher walked, wax in his palm, cord at his belt. He was not plague, he was its clerk. He pulled the edict from inside his vest and ran his finger down the clauses to feel the comfort of words that held while bodies did not. How much hunger would you endure for a city's peace? How much humiliation for a promise of safety, spoken by a man with an iron seal? The day thinned to evening. The crimson ribbon on the edict seal darkened, as if it bled in reverse. In the upper chamber of the palazzo, the priors loosened their collars and spoke of harvest levies and burial fees to pay the watchers and the gravediggers. A small assessment, they called it, to be collected with the bread tax at the gate. The city was always a mouth and a purse, in plague as in rain. A boy coughed and slept. A mother knelt and did not move for a long time, because even stillness, under an edict, is a kind of obedience that steals less from dignity than fear does. Outside, at the fountain gate, the padlock cooled in the night air, and it sweated. The cord on the door creaked once more as the wood settled, and then all sounds were bell and the city's slow breath, in and out, like a tide that could not be commanded. The levy came like a second bell inside the first. The prior's small assessment walked out of the palazzo on 2 legs, a clerk with a ledger and a pair of beadles with iron-tipped staves, and found its way to doors that already wore cords. They called it the watcher's wage, a penny from every hearth to pay for cords, wax, and graves. Men in narrow hoods, shoulders dusted with lime, murmured that burying the dead had become a trade like any other, with rates and schedules and honor. The city, which had been a chorus of prayers and coughs, added the scratch of quills against parchment, the counting of pennies into a purse with a mouth like a wound. At Alina's door the custodian left the jug and the bread, and on the third day the levyman's mark, a chalk circle cut by a vertical line. The mark meant, pay when the cord comes off, or stand on the stool. It meant, even while you are shut in, the city steps inside your future and takes a chair. Alina pressed her forehead to the plank, and breathed the wood's coolness until her lips tasted dust. She had paid a half lira for a draught of water in silence. Now the city named a price for the watcher's gaze. The rakers' carts creaked more often through the lanes. Cesspits behind tenements, built to drink 100 winters, were asked to swallow the fear of one summer, and they failed. The ordinance said no pit may overflow into a public way. It fined the household, and if no household could pay, it fined the neighbor who had said nothing sooner. Men in leather aprons waded in with poles and scoops, their faces set in a calm that made onlookers sicker than the stench did. They tied ropes to barrels and hauled up the city's stomach. On a morning when the bells were merciful and rang late, one raker pulled out a child's doll, a twisted thread figure, heroic in its smallness, and held it aloft like a relic. The crowd groaned, and the beadles shouted for quiet, and the raker's helper, a boy who had learned to breathe like a swimmer, blinked hard and looked away. He had not known that anything stitched for love could end in a cesspit. A warden of clothes measured sleeves with a rod of alder. The edict against vanity, dormant in an age of lice, woke with vigor because control likes company. A wedding went forward in San Bartolo's shadow, poor but hopeful, scraps of ribbon, a bright bead on a bodice. The warden arrived at the gate before the bread had been blessed. He counted the bride's ribbons, 1, 2, and took the third in his fist. Above station, he said mildly, with a craftsman's pride in his craft. He cut the ribbon with iron shears that clicked like beadles. He clipped the groom's cuffs to 3 fingers' breadth. He wrote a fine that would buy grain for a week. The priest watched and did not interfere. Humility was a virtue that cost him nothing. The guests stood, clean and ashamed, laborers dressed as if for confession. A child threw a flower and missed. The warden's scribe dipped his quill, the motion so neat it could have been penance. At the north gate, where the stocks took men like a mill takes grain, the baker who had run his loaves light kept his head on the wood and recited the psalms he knew by weight rather than by faith. The inspector read the assize aloud, each column exact as a gravestone, so many ounces for so many denarii, under penalty of pillory. Men who had never weighed anything more delicate than a sack of barley found themselves suddenly jealous for the accuracy of scales. It was a thing the city could master. Accuracy was a plank under the foot. Plague was a river in spate. The bathhouse stayed shut, its copper cauldrons bright as helmets. Stray cat slept on a turned tub and was shooed with more gentleness than any man had received in a week. The bathmen, unemployed priests of warmth, were told to pour vinegar on the cathedral floor before processions and to hold lanterns at corners where the lanes turned blind. They bowed with the dignity of men forced to carry a different element than water, and made light into a profession to survive the absence of steam. By the cistern, a whisper took root. If the levy was for cords and wax, why did the prior's lamps burn late with fresh oil? If the watcher's wage came from empty bowls, why did the palazzo's kitchen smell of meat broth when the wind turned north? The whisper twined with another, that the relics had been multiplied, that a single saint's bone had shivered into 10 in a season, all deserving to be carried, all demanding candles. No one said theft, said multiplication, and the word lay down like a plank between fear and blasphemy. On the 5th day of the cord, Alina's boy woke with eyes clear as the river before Tannery, his neck tender but no longer a stone. The girl slept as if she had been hiding all night from a game that had no rules and could not be won. Alina held her breath until not breathing became a prayer, then let it out and tasted the room anew. Stale bread, wool blanket, a hint of onion, the ghost of vinegar, the fine metallic tang that always comes from fear. She stood and straightened the cloths and made the bed as if in making it she could order the world. When the watcher came, he knocked gently, once, and listened for her step before he spoke through the plank. 3 more days, he said. If there is no swelling. if there is no sudden flame in the eyes. He sounded tired enough to tell truth without counsel. She touched her fingers to the cord and felt its braid, its purpose. She did not tell him that the boy's fever had broken. Knowledge is a currency like any other, and she had learned to hide coins. Past noon, the levy man found his way to the lime field, where men raked quicklime over grave trenches with long wooden spades that left their hands blistered under leather. He stepped along the path with care, as if the ground would take his measure and find him light. He asked the gravedigger about fees, about the list of plots, about whether the city's generosity, that is, forgiveness of tithe for the new widowed, had been recorded and compensated from the levy. The gravedigger kept his eyes on the pattern his rate cut, and said yes and yes and yes, and the levy man wrote a note in a hand that would not. At the cheese gate, the inspector tapped a brass weight and listened to its ring, a habit that calmed him. In the queue, a woman wore a bodice with 2 lines of dull pewter studs, inherited from a sister who had died in winter past. The warden of clothes eyed the studs and sighed as if he had been given an extra sin to tally. He stepped forward, raised his rod, and measured the pattern against a table of persons. Wives of masters may wear, wives of journeymen may not. Remove them, he said, or pay. The woman stood still. A murmur rose, not loud, not yet. The inspector set down his weight. The beadle's hand drifted toward his rod, as if the rod were a memory of authority tougher than the man's own spine. The studs, no more valuable than buttons, grew heavy with meaning. "We are measuring pewter while the air kills," someone said. The beadle chose to hear it as philosophy rather than law-breaking, and the moment passed like a cough choked off. In the palazzo, they prepared a show trial. It had been decided that the city needed a story where guilt could be placed on a face rather than a wind. A miller from the North Bridge, accused of mixing bran beyond allowance and of washing sacks at the forbidden fountain to hide the dust, was brought before the priors. He had the look of a man carved from damp wood, swollen, unhappy, smelling of meal. The charge was read with music in it. The clerk's voice liked the curve of the law. The miller admitted to mixing bran, he said, for hunger's sake, and to stretch what was left, since the Lord's stores had already been called upon for mercy loaves. The washing he denied. He was taken to the underhall, not a dungeon fit for legends, but a real one, low and wet and smelling of iron and old straw. The turnkeys did their work with neatness, keys on a ring, name in a book, hands on a shoulder, not to bruise, but to move. He was given a pallet, a ladle of thin broth, and the scolding lecture they gave all new prisoners about rats and how to tuck their bread in the crook of the knee to keep it from being taken in sleep. Confession in Pistoia needed no rack. It leaned on hunger and on the certainty that the city liked to see the arc of guilt and punishment drawn cleanly at least once a week. He confessed to what would earn him the pillory and save him the dungeon's winter. The priors nodded, the clerk wrote. The beadle rehearsed his steady voice. News went out, not by bell, which was too busy, but by mouths, that the city would see justice on the morrow, and that it would be instructive. The millboy heard and rehearsed the faces he intended to watch. At dusk, a procession wound its slow 18 turns, longer than the route warranted, because length felt like devotion. The relic was not St. Atto's splinter this time, but a nail said to have kissed the cradle of a martyr's bier. It glittered in a glass like any nail, its glory borrowed from storytelling. Priests sang. A held note quivered like a suspect rope. A banner unfurled a crimson tongue, and men wept without knowing which sorrow had been touched. A beadle rhythmically tapped his rod at corners. The tap said, "Here is where you do not stop, here is where you bow." The bathmen's lanterns made a shallow gold on wet stone, as if the city's veins glowed through its skin. Near the fountain gate, still chained, padlock still sweating, a knot of men gathered to talk of the levy. The watcher's wage had been collected in a street where the cord stood like a scarecrow 2 doors out of every 10, and it had not gone down well. "We pay to be watched," said a carter, "and again to be buried. They take a penny at the door and another at the ditch." He had a voice that clattered like harness. "Let them take the meat from the palazzo," said a tanner who had not smelled anything but lime in 3 months. "Let them burn the prior's clothes for plague, and we will measure sleeves upon them." The beadle made a note to move them along, but his rod stayed at his side. He knew the difference between a gathering and a riot. This was the first becoming the second, and his breath grew shallow. The riot did not break like a wave. It filled like a cistern. A bolt of cloth went up like a standard. A stone clacked against the palazzo's wall. A boy, the same boy who had laughed at the wrong note in the Miserere, threw the first onion. It burst like a thought and stung no one. Then a bucket from a window, a shout, a door slamming, not because of fear but because of privacy. The beadle blew his whistle, and the sound was too thin for the size of the lane. Men moved, not as soldiers but as men wanting to be seen together. The levy man's ledger snapped shut like a jaw. Someone kicked the padlock, as useless as kicking a day. Someone tested the chain and found it as indifferent as iron. A tile slid from a roof and smashed, a stupid accident that in a city under strain is called a sign. The priors sent out 6 men with halberds and faces trained to blankness. The halberds made an order around themselves. The beadle climbed a step and read the clause against unlawful assembly, each word a bead on a string he hoped would hold. A woman in the crowd, not Alina, who was counting her boy's breaths, shouted that hunger was lawful, and the men with halberds looked at the beadle to see if the clause covered shouting. The beadle, who had learned law like measurements, not like poetry, shrugged his smallest shrug. The halberdiers advanced a handspan. The crowd backed a handspan. Then someone threw a handful of flour. It bloomed into a white cloud and turned coats into ghosts. Men laughed. It was the laughter of tired men, and it saved a limb or two. The prior's men did not wade in. The knot loosened, then tightened again around the smaller grievance, the chain on the fountain. A smith stepped forward with a hammer, and in that second the beadle saw the day dividing. Either the padlock holds and the men tire and go home, or the padlock breaks and the day earns a new name. He raised his rod and brought it down not on a skull, but on the smith's wrist. The hammer fell, the chain held, and a dozen women pulled the men back by sleeves and collars, a maneuver older than any edict. The riot became a story about a hammer. The next morning, at the stocks, the miller stood, and the beadle made his voice a stave, for mixing bran in excess of the assize, and for profanation of the city's fountains. This man is punished. Children gathered, their eyes bright with a terrible relief. The story was right-sized, a wrong that could be named, a neck clamped, not a breath stolen by an invisible thing. Flour dust rose from the baker's apron like a blessing denied. The gravedigger, passing by with his rake over his shoulder, paused a second longer than he needed to, and then walked on. He had learned to keep moving, as everything that stuck acquired a price. In the alley behind Alina's building, a raker set his pole and levered open a cesspit hatch. The smell came up, a sermon about what men are. A neighbor leaned out and asked when he would finish. The raker said when the pit stopped arguing. The neighbor wanted to laugh and couldn't. The raker's boy found a lice comb stuck to a crust of fat and passed it up with 2 fingers. The raker nodded as if it were treasure. He would sell it for a slice of bread and a story, from the time of the plague, a provenance that added weight to anything. The boy looked at the comb's teeth and thought of the warden measuring sleeves. He wondered if anyone measured lice. On the 7th day, the watcher returned to Alina's door with his cord and wax. He pressed his thumb to the knot and felt it firm. He listened. The boy's breathing was ordinary, the small whistle of a nose no one had thought much about until sickness tuned the world. He untied the cord with the ceremony he had practiced for release. Slow, reverent, because if the city could not win at plague, it could at least finish a sentence with grace. He lifted the wax and kept it. Men keep tokens of their work to remind themselves they did a thing that held. Go, he said softly through the wood. At sunset. Not before. Wash the floor. Burn the rags. Do not wash at the bathhouse. Do not draw water at the tannery sluice. Present yourself to the guild for bread. It was all city and law, and he hated that he had learned to say it like a litany. Alina nodded, though he could not see it. She felt the cool where the cord had been, and put her hand against it as a child puts a hand against a missing tooth. The girl cheered a whisper, then quieted herself without being told. The boy asked for onion and slept, and Alina laughed, the sound a broken bowl made whole by hands. At sunset, she stepped into the lane. The air felt like something borrowed. Neighbors nodded with a careful kindness that does not touch the face. The cistern's custodian, seeing her, raised a finger tipped with chalk. He was prepared to say the hours and the rules. She bowed before he could speak, a submission offered like a coin to stop a longer tax. She scrubbed her floor with vinegar until the smell felt like safety. She burned the cloves in a brazier and watched smoke write a script she could not read against the low sky. She took the levyman's chalk circle with a rag and smudged it into nothing, then went to the guild's table where bread was given on saints' days, and now on plague days also, which felt like a kind of saints' day with no feast. The bread was smaller. The inspector had adjusted the weights again, and his mouth had the look of a man whose sleep is a set of numbers. She took 2 loaves, and thank saints she did, and did not believe in by name. The guild scribe marked her family in a hand that made the act look like music. The bathhouse door, still shut, bore a new paper nail, a reminder that those caught washing linen there would pay and be named aloud. A woman ran her fingers over the words, and said she had never been named at church except when she married, and when she confessed to hating her sister-in-law for a day. Now they would say my name for cloth, she murmured. The bathman passing by touched his forehead like a soldier saluting a country no one could find on a map. In the palazzo, the priors added a clause about barbers, no lancing, no opening of swellings, shaving beards in alleys forbidden. The barber Jacopo, who had sharpened razors and gossip with equal skill, looked at his tools and felt them turn into contraband. He told his apprentice to wrap the blades in oilcloth and wait. We will cut nails, he said, and we will listen, and we will pretend that men do not come for bleeding. The city has tied a cord on my trade and pressed wax. The apprentice nodded and put his fingers into a bowl of hot water, craving the warmth more than the clean. At the lime field, the gravedigger took a breath and smelled meat, real meat, cooking from the prior's kitchen as the wind did its treachery with direction. He looked up at the palazzo, then down at the trench, and did not let the thought form a sentence. He spread lime as if writing a word he refused to read. His hands remembered his father's palm on his skull when he was a boy, and had spoken too quickly about taxes in a year of hoarfrost. He blessed his hands for the memory and kept them moving. Would you have shouted at the palazzo? Or would you have learned what to smell and what to call wind? Night fell clean as bread cut with a new knife. The city's bell told the hour in a voice that had learned fatigue. In the church, a priest counted coins into the tithe chest, and then took some out, for a widow, for a child, and made notes that would never match the notes in the prior's ledger. He sighed and told the sacristan to polish the relis case until the little bells rang on their own. Alina sat her boy on her knee and showed him the cord, now coiled like a snake asleep. She did not say it had been a leash. She did not say it had been a promise. She said it had kept them in good company with those who waited and those who watched. She plucked a thread and tied it around his wrist, not in crimson, not in iron, but in the color of linen, and told him that some bonds are made to keep close what fear would scatter. A rumor came down from the hills that men had been seen riding with sacks of salt tied under their cloaks, the levy's hands already reaching past the city walls. The guilds muttered about tolls, the priors adjusted the schedule of processions, the bathmen trimmed their wicks. The watcher emptied his pouch of wax nubs and lined them up on his table like teeth. He counted, not to measure success, but to give his hands something to do that did not tie or seal. Carts rolled under the gate with squeals like mice. The stock slept, wood swollen with the day's sweat. The chain on the fountain cooled and creaked. Somewhere in the underhall a turnkey turned in his sleep and kept his hand on his ring of keys. They were heavy, and he dreamed of swimming with them in a river that had no plague and no smell and no law but current. In the morning, the bells would ring again, and the city would rehearse its scripts: edict, levy, inspection, procession, penalty. It would add a new scene: a beadle reading the names of those forgiven the tithe, a gift paid for by the same hands it blessed. It would tighten a clause and loosen a cord and call those motions mercy. The air would taste of iron and onion, straw and smoke, as it had yesterday and would tomorrow. And if one woman, in the second lane past the cheese gate, wore a single crimson thread on her bodice that had not been there before, the warden of clothes would measure it and hesitate, because even men who love rules have mothers, and sometimes a color is not vanity but a mark of survival. Tell me, would you have paid the watcher's wage with an open palm? Or would you have clenched your fist and hidden a copper under the floorboard, and called it prudence, and called it hope? By Michaelmas the city had bent, not broken. The priors, counting coins with tired lips, ordered the fountain unchained for 2 hours at dawn, under a watch and a new rule. The rope would pass from hand to hand, 1 bucket each, no washing, no talk. The padlock hung there still, jaw slack, to remind the stone of its own obedience. The riot became a memory with edges filed down, not to lie, only to live with. The levy called watcher's wage ripened into habit. Some paid and said it was mercy. Some hid coppers beneath loose boards or inside hollowed loaves and called it prudence. Some stood on the penitent's stool with basil in their mouths and let the city rehearse its favorite joke. The basil smelled clean and green and a little like despair. The beadle kept his eyes on the rod in his hand, so he would not have to keep them on the faces he named. He had learned that, when a law cannot be loved, it must at least be conducted. The miller's sentence finished, he walked home with wrists raw as cut bark, flour clinging to the sore places like a blessing that did not know where to land. He set his hand against the mill's stone, felt it cold as law, and touched his forehead to it anyway. The assize was posted anew with a neatness that insulted hunger. The inspector of weights rubbed a smudge from his badge and whispered to himself the ounces and the denarii, the way a boy whispers saints' names for courage. Alina washed her floor until the grain of the wood lifted and softened. She burned the rags in a pan with onion skins. The smoke smelled like soup and funeral both. Her boy sat up, neck tender but no longer a verdict. He wanted bread, and then a story, and then to sleep without fear of missing the bell. The girl wore her thread doll at her belt, its yarn hair singed from being too near the brazier, a relic born of the very season that would later be used against it at the market as a seller's tale. From the plague year, they would say, and it would make the thread worth a copper more. On a Sunday when the wind turned kindly, and brought only the smell of tallow and fry bread through San Bartolo's arch, the priest stood at the tithe chest and spoke of forgiveness toward 3 names. He let the coins he returned clink loudly into palms so that pity would be mistaken for policy. The sacristan, who used to polish the reliquary to a mirror and admire his nose in martyrdom's reflection, now polished it only until the little bells whispered, "Enough." He had lost the taste for shine. The watcher walked his route with a pouch of new wax and a pocket of old nubs he could not quite throw away. He stopped at the corner where the riot had almost been a riot, and traced with his thumb the place where a stone had lipped the palazzo's grapevine plaster. He did not like remembering that a wall could bruise and a city could flinch. He preferred cords and clauses because they stayed put until a hand touched them. Still, he began to tie the cords with a softer pull, so they would creak less when the sun warmed them and scare fewer children in the noon heat. No decree had asked him for mercy. Nevertheless, here it was, small and useless and human. The bathhouse opened not as a bathhouse, but as a place to boil vinegar and heat oil for lanterns. The bathmen became keepers of flame and of scraped soot. They stood at corners during processions with light cupped like forbidden fruit, and the city's faces looked briefly like saints' faces, not for holiness but for the way light loves bone. At the lime field, graves filled to a schedule no one admitted there was. The gravedigger, whose hands had learned the grammar of weight, paused sometimes with his rake over his shoulder and counted the bells backward, willing to believe that time could be walked in reverse. He did not shout at the palazzo. He learned what to smell and what to call wind. When the prior's kitchen sent its broth smell over the trench, he closed his mouth and said the prayer for the dead with his lips against his teeth until it came out as a hum. He had found a way not to hate work that kept its own strict hours. The warden of clothes tightened his rod to an extra finger's breadth on feast days and loosened it again afterward, a private policy that dressed itself in fairness. He carried the iron shears less like a threat and more like a badge of office that had lost its appetite. He let one crimson thread go by on a bodice without measuring. He remembered a mother in his own house who once tied such a thread to a cradle and called it a guard against the evil eye. It was not written in the city's rule, but it was written in him, and sometimes in plague year that was a better law. The boy who had laughed at the wrong note grew quiet for a season. He learned to carry water exactly half full, so that it would not slosh and tell on him at a forbidden hour. He learned how to take bread to a neighbor without making a ceremony of it. He learned the palazzo's guard schedule by the sound of boots on the stone when he played at not playing in the lane. He would grow into a man who could tell the difference between a law meant to keep peace and one meant to polish authority. If he was asked how he learned it, he would say, "The bells taught me." When the afternoons began to tilt cooler and the city's cough softened, the priors unlocked their collars. They removed the claws about cats. The rats had written their petition with teeth so neatly even the palazzo had to read it. They permitted the bathhouse to wash linen under supervision and added a fee to pay the watcher's cousin, who held the lantern. They kept the watcher's wage. They kept the stocks. They kept the assize and the warden and the beadles' rod. Terror may pass. Infrastructure loves to stay. Alina took the boy and girl to the cistern at dawn. The custodian's chalk finger lifted. She showed her palms, empty, honest in the only way that mattered that morning. The rope was passed hand to hand. Her fingers learned the roughness again and called it friend. The bucket came up black-rimmed and shining. The girl, too young for the city's algebra, laughed at water. The sound did not make the beadle tap his rod. The sound entered the stone and made no law against itself. In the years after, when men tried to remember exact dates and found that fear had turned days to fog, someone would take down the edict from the church door, crackle creased and soot smudged, and copy it into a book. The book would live in a chest with a lock that sweated on summer nights. Children would watch the clerk's hand and marvel that the city could be made of ink, cords and wax flattened into lines that did not smell of vinegar or onion, punishments that did not blister the skin. The clerk would blow sand on the wet letters and say the words softly as he wrote them. For comfort, No entering, no leaving, no washing, no games, no laughter. And sometimes, by accident, or because he was human and had been a boy once himself, he would write the word laughter and not cross it out. Alina aged into the kind of woman the market listened to without admitting it. She could tell you which inspectors counted slow and which scales ran generous. She could name the days when the bathhouse steam rose like a blessing rather than a warning. She kept the wax seal the watcher had lifted from her door in a little cup with cloves and a lice comb bought from a raker's boy. And when the girl, now tall, asked why, Alina said, to remember how ties can be cut and still leave a mark, and how marks can teach gentleness. She said it with a voice that had learned to forgive the bell for telling the truth. The watcher, older, kept walking. He watched as a city forgot how to look behind its own shoulder. He married the woman who sold vinegar by the spoon and learned how to sleep beside a smell that had once meant panic. He kept the pouch of old wax beside the bed until it turned brittle as paper and crumbled, and he did not sweep it quickly. He let the crumbs lie like dust from a holy place, and then, on a morning with no procession, he opened the window and brushed them into the street, where feet would make them small and smaller, until they belonged to no one and all. The gravedigger lived long enough to find that lime will leave your hands if you keep them in warm water. He died in a bed and not a trench, and men said that was a victory, and women said softly, all deaths are a kind of tax. At his funeral, a priest put his hand on the tithe chest and said a prayer for the city that had measured everything and known almost nothing. The stocks rotted, repaired, rotted again. The halberds rusted and were ground bright and rusted once more. The warden's shears clicked on ribbon and on nothing. The assize changed its numbers. The fountain chain was moved, for a while, to the cattle gate, and then returned, like so many laws, to where it began. And if you walked the lane in winter and asked what the plague had done to Pistoia, a mother might point to her boy, tall now, with a scar where the cord's not used to knock against the door, and say, it taught us to count breath as if it were bread. It taught us that a crown may glitter, but the seal that matters is the one pressed on your door and on your days. She would go back to her sweeping, a simple work that feels like sovereignty in a world that loves dust. What price would you have paid for a day without the rod? What coin would you hide for a jug of water when the chain sings on iron? Tell me below. If this tale troubled your sleep, listen next to the market that fined the poor for washing, or the village that paid taxes for a king they never saw.